historian, an author, and a lecturer, and has been employed in the pharmaceutical industry for the past 15 years. Darvin began researching his own family history at the age of 10 years old. And at that time, never dreamed how science or DNA would enable any of us to connect with others in a world family tree, which we can do. It is exciting. So thank you, Darvin, for researching how the Mast connect with DNA and for sharing this morning. Let's give him a hand.
Okay, thank you, Lois Ann. Is this mic on? Everybody can hear me fine with this mic? Am I right? Good, okay. I may bounce around a bit, but I'll use this mic predominantly. First thing, I noticed that we have some artifacts here, right? I mean, we have Jacob Mast's frock coat, right? And some other things. Probably some of you brought artifacts here. Anybody? Artifacts from Mast, your grandparents, great-grandparents, or even further back? Who brought some artifacts here? Oh, now a lot more of you need to raise your hand because DNA is also an artifact. And you have the Mast DNA here with you. So everybody's hand should be up. That's a blood descendant of one of the Masts, as I am. Some of you, of course, have married in, and you're all welcome. But there's lots of artifacts here. And that's one of the prime things. DNA is an artifact that gets passed down through our parents. Of course, we get our DNA from mom and dad, and mom and dad gets it from their mom and dad. And the way that we can see this is that we look like our parents. Am I right? You know, as you get older, don't you look either like your mother or your dad, more so? For me, it's my body shape is like my mom's dad, my maternal grandfather, but my face is like my dad. As I get older and older, I look like my dad. This is because my DNA comes from my mom and dad, gets expressed as proteins in our body, and proteins make up how we look, the shape of our faces, and all of that. Plus some of our psychology and all of that as well. That comes from our DNA. What we like, what we don't like, things like that. So another example of that would be when my wife and I were engaged. She came to Martin Gathering, the first time that my aunts and uncles saw my wife-to-be. We weren't married quite yet. And my aunt through marriage, came up to my wife, never saw her before, and came up to her and said, "You must be a Burkholder." Now, my wife's name is not Burkholder, it's Crispin, but her mother is a Burkholder. So I was like, I told Rini, I said, how did you know that Burkholder is in her family? Well, it's something to do with the shape of the nose. She could tell, just from the shape of the nose. Now, this is also DNA. This is DNA. Now, I can't say my wife has an odd-looking nose or anything like that. It looks normal to me. But there's something in that my Aunt Rini, who is also a Burkholder, recognized in my wife that they had common ancestry. And it goes back many, many generations, more than 10 generations ago. So all this is DNA. It's DNA getting passed down through families. And now that we, since the 1990s, have been able to study the chemistry of DNA, we've been able to trace this, and we can use this then to solve genealogical puzzles. And so with that, Lois Ann said that I started the DNA pilot project back in 2010. We've changed that name to Mennonite and Amish Immigrants to Pennsylvania DNA Project, and it's on the web now. You can Google it. If you Google Mennonite and Amish DNA or Mennonite and Amish Immigrants DNA, it'll show up as the first or second hit. And the project, here I have the actual address of it is right there. If you want to write that down, or I think these slides will be available later too, right? So I have, on this slide, I had that it's 423 members. There's like 490 now. I put this slide together a few months ago. And there's almost 500 members in the project. Anybody that is in any remote way connected to Amish or Mennonite ancestry is welcome to join the project. In fact, DNA works the same for anybody in the world. So I actually welcome anybody to join the project, even if they have a remote interest. If there's any way that they're connected or have an interest in Amish and Mennonite DNA, they're welcome to join the project. Now, the project has 3 different types of DNA involved. There's Y DNA that comes from your father and goes to the males. So only males have Y DNA. It gets passed from father to son. There's mitochondrial DNA that gets passed from the mother to all her children. So I have my dad's Y DNA. I have my mom's mitochondrial DNA. My sisters also have my mom's mitochondrial DNA, but my sisters don't have Y DNA. And then there's autosomal DNA that comes from all your ancestors and shows you your ethnicity and things like that. When we talk about the Ancestry DNA test, that's autosomal DNA. And we can use that to connect families together. The project, though, because it's focused on genealogy, the project is mostly focused on Y DNA. And the reason for that is that Y DNA follows the surnames. So here in Western societies, we have our surnames that get passed from fathers to sons, and then the women get married and they take on their husband's surnames. So Y DNA ends up being very easy to connect to genealogy because the surnames follow Y DNA through these families. So there would be a Martin DNA signature, and there would be a Mast DNA signature. We're going to talk about that today. A Mast Y DNA signature. If you look at all the other DNA, there are differences, but the Y DNA should be pretty much the same among the Mast family, unless they're 2 different origins. Now, we have that in the Martins. Martin is a very common name. Not all the Martins come from Switzerland the way that my family does. There are Martins in England and France and in Ireland, all over the place in Europe. And there are different Y DNA signatures because the Martin family has all these different origins in many different places. Is that the same for the Mast? So far, we only have one real Mast DNA signature, but we'll get to that. So in the project, I have some purposes. To determine the specific signatures, Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA of various Mennonite and Amish families, and then when we compare these signatures, we can find out things like if a family from California has one of these Mennonite or Amish names, do they connect to Lancaster County? Well, maybe the genealogical record isn't complete, or maybe they went out there and all the records are lost or whatever. Does that family connect to Lancaster County? And sure enough, these North Carolina Masts, they have the Mast DNA signature, the same one that's here. So we know that that family connects. The genealogy's there, and we've confirmed it with the DNA. Well, sometimes there are these families that don't have the genealogy, and then we can confirm it. Say, for instance, Martin. We've realized that there's some Martins in Texas that relate back here to Lancaster County. They had no idea. But their DNA signature, when they test, they match the Martins in Lancaster County. So that's one of the objectives. Another objective is to link families together that we otherwise would not consider linked. Like if there are these families that are kind of unknown in their genealogy, well, if their DNA says that they're linked together, then we can try to figure out, well, how does that make sense according to the genealogy? We can determine which families are more closely related in cluster groups. Some families have more than one immigrant ancestor, like the Masts. So if you're one of those unknown Masts out there that don't know which immigrant group of Masts that you connect to, testing your DNA may help to solve that puzzle and may help you figure out then, it would be like a little hook that you can put together that, well, maybe now the DNA says I'm part of this family, so how does that work out genealogically? So that becomes another purpose of this project, to link those families together. And then we want to assess and categorize the genetic diversity among Swiss, German, and Dutch families, those with Mennonite background. How homogeneous are they? How diverse are they? And we find out that they're actually very ethnically diverse, and I'll get to that in a second as we go through the presentation. So those are the kind of purposes of this presentation, or purposes of this project, and the Masts fit into this project, and I'll show you how that works out here in a bit. But some of the, just to give you some examples of some of the surnames that I have represented in the project and what we found out based on that. The Souder name, which is familiar here in Lancaster County. How many here have ancestry in the Souder family? So a few of you do. Okay, it's a common Mennonite name here. Well, we found out the Suder name in Switzerland is the same as the Souder name. And we've tested people that descend from Suders that kept the name Suder, and we tested people with the name Souder, both the version that's S-O-U-D-E-R and S-A-U-D-E-R, and we found out that they're all the same family. So we made that genealogical connection through the DNA. But we also found something a little unusual, that there's a Souder family in Lancaster County, the ones that are in that little town called Soudersburg along Route 30, and the descendants of that family have a different Y DNA signature than the Souders, the Mennonite Souders in Lancaster County, the ones in, say, Weaverland. So there are two different signatures then. They come back from two different origins. Both are Swiss families, but they have two different origins. That family would be a separate family than the other families. You can see here all the variations of this name. Well, how do you link them together? DNA is really the only way that we can link them together if the signatures end up being the same. The same is true for this family here, Zimmerman. How many descend from Zimmermans? There are a few that descend from Zimmermans as well here. So Zimmerman is a name that has the same Y DNA signature as the name Carpenter in North Carolina. So again, Dot talked about many Mennonite and some Amish immigrants and Brethren immigrants going to North Carolina from Lancaster County. The same happened with the Zimmerman family, but they changed their name to Carpenter in North Carolina, and we only found out about this when they tested and the DNA signatures match. So this Carpenter family matches the Zimmermans matches the Zimmermans here. Carpenter family in North Carolina matches the Zimmermans here. So then we had to figure out, well, how do they get together genealogically? What is the family history here? And it so happens there was a Hans Zimmerman in East Cocalico Townships in 1794 that went bankrupt. His land was sold by sheriff's sale, and he disappeared. It looks like he moved to North Carolina with his children, his wife and children, and changed his name to Carpenter. And now we found him. Now we found him through the DNA. Now, why would he change his name to Carpenter? What is a carpenter in German? A Zimmermann, yes. So it's just anglicizing the name. All he did was anglicize the name. But we found him now looking at DNA. Now, there are many Zimmerman DNA signatures. There is one that's the Mennonite Zimmermans here, and these Carpenters in North Carolina match that one Mennonite Zimmerman DNA signature. So that's how we know that they're connected. But a name like this, which is an occupation, there will be many different signatures, because surnames, when they developed, maybe 500, 600, 700 years ago, a surname like Zimmerman would have developed by anybody who was a carpenter. Anybody that worked with wood could have potentially had the name Zimmerman. So there will be many different DNA signatures for that name, because it developed as an occupation. A name like Mast, we don't know exactly how it developed, but it looks like there's only one signature. Maybe we'll find more at some point, but at this point it looks like there's only one. A name like Wenger, how many descend from Wengers? There's a few people here that descend from Wengers as well. So we have a Wenger DNA signature. So far we've only found one Wenger DNA signature. So it looks like all the Wengers are descended from the same family. But we found something unusual as well among the Wengers. We found a person in Georgia with the name Vineyard, and they match the Wenger DNA signature. And they trace their family back to an Ishmael Vineyard who moved to Georgia from Germany sometime in the early 1800s. Now, if you say Wenger in German, it's Wenger, Vineyard, yeah, it's getting close, right? A transliteration from Wenger to Vineyard. It looks like it's just maybe a corruption, if we would call it that, of the name Wenger, ends up being Vineyard. The DNA is showing this. We wouldn't necessarily expect it without DNA, but the DNA is saying that this Vineyard family is the same as the Wenger family when you go back a few hundred years. So it's these kinds of things that we find out. Oh, here's one too. How many descend from the Hostettlers? Okay. So there was a time when there was some question, are Hochstettlers and Hostetters the same family? They're both Swiss families. Well, we tested all the DNA, the Y DNA, and sure, they're different families. Hochstetler and Hostetter are different families. They're completely separate families. So now in our genealogies and such, we can determine, well, if somebody has the name Hostetter without the L, it's one family. If somebody has the name Hochstetler with the L, it's a different family. The DNA helps to sort that out. So now, I showed a lot of slides up there with a lot of different variants to names. But for Mast, there's only Mast and Mast. Or are there others? I don't know of any others. That's right, Dot, just Mast and Mast. And Moist, okay, sometimes. But are there people with the name Moist today that trace back to the Mast? Okay, so it might be good to have them tested as well, just to make sure that they're in the same family. I should add Moist in here as well. The Mosts, I guess, come from the Somerset County line. The youngest son of the Amishman that moved out to Somerset County had the name Most, or he changed his name Most maybe to differentiate himself. It's that way on his gravestone, and I guess it's all his descendants carry on that tradition, the name Most rather than the name Mast. But the DNA signatures are the same. So we know that they're the same family, and the genealogy confirms it. So I put this slide in here because just a few weeks ago, back at the beginning of July, I was in Asheville, North Carolina, and I didn't intend for this, but I found the Mast Country Store in Asheville, North Carolina, downtown. And here I took a picture of it. You can see on the candy barrel, $9.99 a pound, right up above there, Mast Store. Anybody know the Mast Country Store in Asheville, North Carolina? Is this our family? This is our family. Okay, so if they would test, they would have the same signature. Good. I didn't even know, but I came across that when I was in Asheville just a few weeks ago, and so I took a picture of it for you there. Now, here's a slide that shows all these families. When we look at these, Lois Ann, when she introduced me, said they all fit into a world family tree, and that's true. You can look at Y DNA and trace everything back to a beginning. The scientists call it in Africa, and as we move out of Africa, we differentiate in different ways. So the Mast signature is that R down at the bottom right. It's bottom right, yeah. It's a Celtic signature, which makes a lot of sense because the Mast come from Switzerland, and the Celts, when you think of Celts, you think of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Well, before the Celts were in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, where did they live? They lived in Alpine Europe, which is now Switzerland. But we're talking back in Roman times and pre-Roman times. So some of you that watch TV, you remember Ancestry used to have this little blurb on there where this guy, I cringe when I hear this. And I use Ancestry all the time, so I'm not poking fun of that. But I cringe about this commercial because this guy, his oral tradition said that he has German ancestry, and his great-grandparents, they spoke German or whatever, or their German records or whatever. He gets his DNA tested, and it shows that he's Celtic. So he trades in his Lauterhusen for a kilt. You know which commercial I'm talking about, right? I cringe when I see that commercial because there are so many Swiss families with this Celtic DNA signature. The Masts are one of them. And having a Celtic DNA signature does not mean you come from Scotland or Ireland or Wales. I mean, you could, but those Celts came from Switzerland. So it's simply going back further in time. And I suspect this guy in this commercial is actually German, but Celtic. If you go back before the time of Germany, they were Celts. They were Celts in continental Europe. And our Mast ancestors were also Celts in continental Europe. That's what the signature shows. In fact, there are 6 of these world haplogroups that end up being represented in Switzerland. You see I have the R's down there that include the Mast. Well, the Martins are part of I, and the Hollingers are part of J, and the Goods are part of L, and the Groffs are up there part of E, and the Kurtzes, we talked about Kurtzes a little bit earlier today, are part of G. Out of the 20 haplogroups from all over the world, 6 of them include Swiss families. Now that's pretty amazing. That's a lot of diversity in Switzerland. Now why would it be? Let's think about geography a bit. Before there were buildings and highways and roads, what did people use to move around? The rivers, exactly. Where do the rivers start in all of Europe? In Switzerland. The Rhone River starts in the Alps, flows south to the Mediterranean. The Rhine River, which would be part of our ancestry for sure, starts in Switzerland, moves up through Switzerland, up through the Black Forest of Germany, up to Holland, and then out to the North Sea. And perhaps even more important for our ancient ancestors, our grandsestry. It's a new word, by the way, not just ancestry, grandsestry. Our ancient ancestors would have used the Danube River, which starts in the Black Forest of Germany, flows east through Austria-Hungary, over to Romania, Bulgaria, and empties out of the Black Sea. These rivers would have been migratory routes of ancient peoples, and as people began to settle in Europe, they would have moved further and further upstream on these rivers, and as you moved further upstream, where did you end up? In these mountains in Switzerland. Why would you settle in the mountains? Probably for protection. Those of you that have been over to Switzerland, those are deep, steep valleys. You can be protected from hordes of armies that are coming through in these valleys. And the Mast probably lived up here in these valleys for thousands of years as Celts. So, with DNA, you can this information. You can determine, well, which of your families lived in Europe, lived in the Alps for thousands of years, such as the Mast. Which of them migrated in from somewhere else? Like I said, the Groff family, important Mennonite family here as well, has the E haplogroup signature. That's Mediterranean Europe. They come from southern Italy, moved up to Switzerland. The Martins have an I signature. They come from northern Europe and moved down into Switzerland, probably at the time the Roman Empire fell apart. The Masts would have been living in these mountains during the time of the Roman Empire and before the time of the Roman Empire, for a few thousand years anyway. And here I have some of the, and this slide will be included in whatever Dan's putting together and such for all of you. Here I have a bunch of the common Mennonite and Amish surnames that are in the project and their haplogroup signature, just for information. By the way, anybody that joins the project, the information that's online in the project is all anonymous in terms of your identity is not shown there. If your surname is shown for sure, because that information is useful for us to put genealogy together and things like that, but your identity is not shown there. I mean, there are obviously privacy issues related to DNA and such, so if you want to, you can put your immigrant ancestor on there. That's helpful for people doing genealogy. You don't necessarily need to. It can just be a blank space, but your surname will show up. And that's how we keep it more or less anonymous. Of course, if it was totally anonymous, then it wouldn't be useful for genealogy. But we try to keep it as anonymous as possible. Now for here, I do have some information related to the people that have tested, but because this is a reunion, we'll keep that inside the reunion. That's not something that gets publicized necessarily outside of this. But I want to show you how I'm connected to the Mast, and that's through this couple here, Elias Fisher and Hannah Kurtz. And these tombstones are right out there, here at this church. They are my great-great-grandparents, and they lived down in Cambridge, just a few miles from here, just south of Honeybrook. And they're, Amish don't get their pictures taken very often, but it so happens late in life. Hannah died in 1937. Elias died in 1940, so this picture is taken sometime around 1935. We have a picture of them that my grandmother saved. Um, yeah. So I have pictures of them. And then if I go through the Kurtz side, that's where the Masts show up. So if I go back my family history, Hannah Mast's parents are John K. Kurtz and Elizabeth Mast, and she died fairly young, and then John Kurtz married a second time to another lady named Elizabeth, but I come through Elizabeth Mast here, and that's the only way, unlike Dot, who goes 5 times, right? I go 1 time back to Mast, but this is the line. So my great-great-great-grandparents right here. And they owned the farm that is just about a mile to our west here. I have a map right here. Right here's the map. Just on the northeast side of Churchtown, do you see, does this have a way for me to point? I don't know. Does it have a pointer to it? Yeah, there it is. Okay, it's the green light. You see this little cemetery here? Well, that's that little cemetery that's right along 23. This is Route 23 right here, and here, John K. Kurtz right here. So this is Churchtown area, and he's just on the east side of Churchtown, a mile or 2 from here. Passed by the farm on my way over here. And then if I go back 1 other generation, I go to Stephen Mast, who's in CZ's book. Stephen Mast and Hannah Miller. By the way, my daughter's named Hannah after this Hannah. Well, let me clarify that. My grandmother's name is Hannah, and she was named after both her grandparents. So she was named after Hannah Kurtz, and Hannah Kurtz was named after her grandmother, who's this Hannah Miller. So those Hannahs go back at least to 1805, and that's why my daughter has the name Hannah as well. So names stay in families, not just surnames, right? Names do stay in families. And Stephen Mast, I guess lived at Masthoff, right? I mean, that's where his father lived there. They set up the farm, and your namesake was there, right, Dan? And Stephen was there, and then the story, CZ Mast has a story that he finds this unimproved land just to the west, and sets up a new farm on that land, and it's right here. Here's the edge of Lancaster County. Masthoff is right over here someplace, right? And I don't know the name of this road, but this is 23 right here. And right down here, the Isaac Mast farm. Isaac Mast was Stephen Mast's son. I descend through Hannah Mast, the daughter, but his son was set up on this farm. Stephen set up his son on this farm right here. The connection is very close. But let's go back a little further, because the DNA will take us back further and further. In fact, it'll take us back beyond our genealogy. So here's Stephen Mast's father, John Mast, deacon in the Amish church here, died in 1832. He married Mary Kurtz. They lived on the farm there at Masthoff, where the bookstore is and such, where Lamar and Lois Ann lived. And then his dad, of course, is the bishop, John Mast. And then we have all of us, Gerald and Dot, talked about uncle and orphans, right? So this bishop was an orphan, and there were his brothers and sisters that were orphans. And one of the questions that we don't quite have clear is, well, how are these orphans related to those other Mast immigrants? But the DNA very clearly shows that they're closely related, because we have DNA, the Y DNA signature from the male orphans and their male descendants matches very closely to the John and Jacob that we have documented as the earlier immigrant. Which one is the earlier immigrant? The 1737 immigrant and the 1750 immigrant. Their DNA matches very closely. So we suspect that this is a brother, or that the father of this Jacob Mast is a brother to the earlier immigrants. I have here Joseph, just like Dot had. We do not know. I have it as a question mark because we do not know his name. We do not have any documentation that gives his name. He would have died in Europe, and then his children that were orphaned would have came with the other Masts. We suspect that maybe his name was Joseph because what did I say earlier? Names go through families, right? I named my daughter Hannah because it's in our family. there are Josephs in the family, and his brothers would have been John and Jacob, so Joseph is a possibility, but we don't know for sure. And then we can go back further, right? From here, sometimes it's a challenge to get back into Europe because of the records being so scant. But once you can get back into Switzerland, the Reformed Church records are pretty intact for a generation or two. So if we leap from here back into Switzerland, and Gerald talked about some of this, Hans Mast and Hannah Mischler in Gugelsberg, and then you can go back to this Eli Mast and Elizabeth Byler, Byler being an Amish name here as well, but also a name from Gugelsberg. So this becomes very likely that these families would have been Amish. Then Peter Mast and Zwalen. Of course, we don't have the Zwalen name here in Lancaster County, but this is also a very common name in the Gugelsberg area of Switzerland. And then earlier than that, we get back to a Benedict. And then the records are much more scant, except, what did I talk about, artifacts? You know, those artifacts that we have inside, they continue on. So we can go back further with the DNA because we can match those DNA signatures back in time. And Harold actually spent some money to test a large portion of his DNA. And we found ways that we can connect that DNA to other Celts. Unfortunately, there's no other Masts that are tested in Switzerland. Maybe that's something that we can do at some time. Maybe we can find a Mast in Switzerland. Do we know any Masts in Switzerland? Yeah, well, maybe we should test them sometime and see how they match the Masts here. Because we have a dozen Masts that have tested here. But the signature does match Celtic families, but they're in England. Norwood and Coffin are some of the names. And they're in England. But this is 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. It's when the ancestors of those English people actually lived probably in Gugelsberg or up in the Alps from Gugelsberg and then went to England. So you go back further than this, and that's what we found at this point until we get other Masts in Switzerland perhaps tested to see. Remember when we did the Zook reunion, the Zooks match Lances, which is also an Amish name. So some point back in Switzerland, the Zooks and Lances come together as the same family before the time of surnames. With the Masts, we don't have another connection that close. It jumps back 2,000 years or 2,500 years till we find the next match. Now, you only can find a match if people have tested, right? So maybe at some point we will find more of a match to families maybe 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But we need the people to test. So we need more people, I think, in Gugelsberg to test to find out. But there are some other things. I found something interesting that I think I'll share next. Maybe something that Dot or somebody else can research a bit more. You can go to this website. This is the Swiss Archives. And actually they have all, well, I shouldn't say all, most of the church records, including Gugelsberg, are now all online. You can research these any time of day, as long as you have an internet connection, anywhere that you are, as long as you know how to read that German script. Everything's online now. And you can simply go to this site, and you can type in Mast, and you can find out where in the titles of these records, not all the description, but in the titles of these records, do Masts show up. And these records go back into the 1300s and 1400s. So we can get a sense of there were Masts, there were people with the Mast surname back that far. And here is one of them. I found a few places that it said in the 1300s where there were Masts, but then the record's not there. It's just the index of the record. So somebody's going to have to research that. But this one we found. This Paul Mast, and this is in the year 1480. And I just used Google Translate to translate this, and it's not so nice. But Paul Mast, who was imprisoned for all manner of improper misconduct at Grasberg, swears to the cities of Bern and Freiburg on December 20th, 1480. Now, I will say, this record, just the title of it's online, not the actual record. And I don't read German script, so I wouldn't be able to know. If it was there, I wouldn't be able to translate it anyway. But the title is this that I just read, and I translated that. Now, was this guy a bad guy or not? I don't know. He certainly was a Mast, a Paul Mast, but I will say that the language used here by the government, the Swiss government, is very similar to the same language that the Swiss government used about Anabaptists. Right? They talked about us that way. In fact, the people that weren't Anabaptists said, well, there's Anabaptists. They were like the boogeyman out there. You're supposed to be afraid of them. So this language is a bit like that. But this is in 1480, several decades before Anabaptism started. So maybe there's something here. Maybe this guy was a religious nonconformist. Maybe, But somebody's going to have to look up this record. Just the index is there. It's online as a title, but the actual record's not scanned in. So you have to order it from the archives, or you have to go to the archives. Somebody's going to have to look that up. I talk about DNA. I don't talk about this, but it's going to be one of the projects for you guys. And I'll say also, it's not just this Paulus Mass. There are others in the 1400s and in the 1300s. And we have the same for Martins. We have the same for Wangers. These records are showing up in the very areas that we can trace our ancestors from. So we can begin to get back a little bit further. Now, I don't know for sure that Paulus Mast is a direct ancestor, but almost certainly he's the same family. Maybe he's a brother or a cousin to our ancestor. Almost certainly he's the same family, because it's the same area. Grasberg is right beside Gugesberg. Now, this slide, I have an Excel spreadsheet that I shared with the Mast committee that I'm fine with sharing around, as long as we keep it within the Mast descendants group, because this slide shows who is tested, and if we get beyond this, then it becomes a privacy issue. So there are 11, I think there are 12 now, 12 Mast descendants, male Mast descendants that have tested their Y-DNA, and we can sort them out into a chart that shows how they descend from the various Mast immigrants, and then going back into Europe. And I know this is hard to read, but if you request it from the committee, we can send this out. And you can see here, there's a few places. The places here, every place that I have in the light green is somebody that tested, and every place I have in yellow is a change in the DNA signature. And there are only really 2 changes that happen between, say, Lamar, who is tested, and Harold, who is tested. So this shows us that the orphans are very closely connected to the earlier immigrant. There's Harold and Jay's test, and if we go through next, here's a Roger Mast, Lester D. Mast, Delvin tested recently. Delvin's here, right? He tested recently. Yes. So he's in this list as well with the ancestors back. And then there's the Moss that tested here from Jonas Moss from Somerset County. And you can see their signatures all match. And then here's the North Carolina family. There's an Eric Mast that tested that I don't know how to place. Is he here, Eric Mast, that tested? I don't know where, he matches the signature. I don't know how to place him in the family, though, genealogically. And then there's this Creighton William Mast, who descends from the North Carolina family, that matches the signature as well. So that confirms that the North Carolina family is there. I have the John Mast married to Barbara Harmon here, like Dot talked about, but I didn't know how to, is that a son of which immigrant? I don't know the next step. So, he's one of the 1750 orphans. Okay, so I have to include that little line then in with the orphans. Okay, well, that's what I wasn't quite sure of. I knew that it was the same family because of the signature, but I wasn't quite sure how he matched in. So there you have the North Carolina family. This slide here is from the project, and it shows you there were 12 Masts that have tested that I had on the last one. 3 of them have joined the project, and right there they are. The Masts right here, and you can see that they're part of the R group, and a subset of the R group that has this designation. But you can see the Werfel family, the Wangers are here. Here's a Martin that's not part of my family, but another different Martin. Sullenberger, Wismer, Herr, these are all kind of in the same cluster, and there's where the Mast fit into the project. If you become a member of the project, you have access to this data like I show here. If you don't become a member of the project, about half this data shows up. There are those that sign up that say they can display their data publicly, and those that want it to be more private. So if you become a member, you have access to more data than if you don't in the project. And to become a member, you have to test. Now, women can test too, or women can get their male brothers or nephews or cousins tested, but you can join this project with the mitochondrial DNA test or even the autosomal test if you're a woman and want to join the project. That's no problem. Now, I'm going to close with two things, because as I've given talks to reunions and such, there are two things that come up. There's privacy that comes up, and there's the ethnicity question that comes up. And I'm going to talk about both of them. I'm going to first approach it as a myth. So I'm going to challenge you a bit, I guess. I'm going to say it's a myth that our DNA is private. Sure, we are concerned with privacy, and we do everything that we can to keep things private, but it is a myth that our DNA is private. And the reason I say that is because nature doesn't work this way. Nature doesn't work in the way of keeping us all as these distinct individuals. We are a composite of our ancestors. Am I right? We are a product of our parents, and they are products of their parents. So my DNA is not only my own. My cousin shares my DNA, and my second cousin, and my third cousin. Now, as you go back further and further, or further and further away from yourself, they share less and less of the same, but they do share a lot the same. So if you are so private about your DNA that you don't want to test, that's fine. But your sister will test, or your cousin will test, or your uncle will test, and they have a lot of the same DNA that you do. So the idea of our DNA being private, just because of the way nature works, is a bit of a myth. Maybe we like it to be private. Maybe, I mean, I'm concerned about the privacy aspects, but this is the fact of it, that if I decide not to test, well, my cousin who's a Martin will test, and they can get all this information about Martins from him, you know? So thinking that your DNA is private, it's a bit of an illusion, because your DNA is a product of your ancestors, just like your cousin's is and your second cousin's is, okay? So that's the first myth. So I say it's a myth. It's wrong. Our DNA is not private. Even though we like to think it is, it's not private, because our DNA is a composite of our ancestors. And here's an example of it, right? So if I go back my Y DNA line, that's this side here, my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and such. If I go back my maternal line, it's this one. Or any of these other lines, that's the autosomal DNA. Well, I have brothers and sisters here. I have cousins here. I have second cousins here, third cousins here. They all share bits and pieces of the same DNA that makes me who I am, which is why we look a lot the same. Now, this slide kind of goes into the history of how DNA was found out. There's this guy, Gregor Mendel, who was working with pea plants. He was a horticulturalist back in Austria in the 1800s. And he was very systematic about separating out the seeds, making the next generation of pea plants. And he had these peas that were white flowered and peas that were purple flowered. And when he mixed them together in the next generation, every one of them was purple flowered. But when we took those seeds and combined them for the third generation, 1 in 4 had a white flower. And a light bulb went on in his head, and he said, somehow this white flower trait He didn't know how. Nobody knew about DNA back then. But somehow this white flowered trait is in this generation hidden. It's hidden here, and it gets expressed here. Now we know that to be DNA. It is hidden there. There's DNA in these purple-flowered pea plants that is the white flower DNA. It just is hidden. It's covered over, and then it gets expressed in the next generation. Well, that's the same as with us, because sometimes characteristics of the grandparents come out that are not in the parents, right? You probably have them in your own family. I know I have them in mine. So these characteristics come out, but this is the first kind of evidence, I guess, of DNA, even though they didn't know what it was then at that time. That hey, somehow a characteristic gets passed down through generations. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's expressed. We're using these things to determine how to link families together. Here's just another slide that shows this is a cell. Our Y DNA and our autosomal DNA comes from the nucleus. Our mitochondrial DNA comes from the cytoplasm of the cell, which is here in the body of the cell. And then I'll close with this piece, because this is another important piece, because people always ask me, they take these tests like on Ancestry and such. Well, my test shows 25% Swiss, 37% English, and such. My sister, who has exactly the same ancestors as I have, and yeah, exactly the same ancestors, her test says 35% Swiss and 17% British Isles and such. Well, why is that? How can that be? We have the same ancestors, but our ethnicity profiles show up differently. You know what I'm talking about, right? Those of you that have taken these tests. You have percent this, percent that, and if you and your brother or sister take the test, they're not going to match exactly. Why is this? Well, you've got lots of DNA, 3.3 billion base pairs in every one of your cells, about 6 trillion cells, lots of DNA. And you get it from your parents, and your brother and sister get it from your parents, but they get different combinations. And so that's what this is about. So can DNA test exactly for ethnicity? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say wrong. I'm going to say it's a myth. Even though I like Ancestry DNA and all those testing companies, I'm going to say this is a bit of a myth. It can't test exactly. And this is why. First off, what is ethnicity? Is ethnicity just biology? Look this up in the dictionary. Ethnicity, a fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. Nothing in there about biology. Let's say I'm adopted into a family. Let's say I'm adopted into an Amish or Mennonite family, and I grow up Amish, Mennonite, German culture, German food, German songs, all of that, but I'm adopted into the family. Maybe isn't there a story of an Irish orphan that was adopted into a family? Well, if her DNA, Rosanna was her name, right? If her DNA was tested, it wouldn't show up Mennonite or Amish, right? Okay? So, but what is ethnicity? Would she consider her ethnicity to be Irish or Amish? Okay, so is biological ancestry different from ethnicity? I think so. Let's think of it this way. Do your parents, your grandparents, or your great-grandparents stress one tradition over another? I mean, here in America, we have lots of, this is why these tests are really popular, right? We have lots of combinations. You have somebody with a German dad and an Italian mom, or a Polish grandmother and maybe a Spanish father on the one side. These tests are different this way. Is it ethnicity or is it biology? The DNA is going to look at the biology. It's not going to look at the ethnicity. If you have a Polish mom that stresses the Polish traditions and your dad is German, well, maybe you consider yourself Polish, but your DNA will show that you're half German, right? So there's these kind of nuances that go on here. Does your ethnicity directly reflect your biology? Maybe not. Adoption. You know, you have families that have adopted. And perhaps you have some ancestors that have been adopted. How does that impact the DNA? And one last thing as we close. Your DNA is a scramble. And this is why it doesn't work out that your brother and sister, when they test their DNA, it's exactly the same as yours. It's a scramble of your parents. So let's say your father has this DNA. I'm just going to have these 5 colors there. And your mother has the DNA represented by the other 5 colors at the bottom. And they have a child. You get some of your DNA from your dad, some of your DNA from your mom. Right? So this child gets the first 3 markers from his dad and the second 2 markers from the mom. See that? So they have another baby. It's another scrambling. So what happens next? Child 2. Well, guess what? Child 2 gets the first marker from dad, the second and third marker from mom, and the fourth and fifth marker from dad. Right? This is how it works. Now, some of these markers might be that deep Polish ancestry or that Middle Eastern ancestry or that Native American ancestry, and some of them might be the Swiss German part. But the children aren't exactly the same. Do they look exactly the same? Well, if they're identical twins, they will. But then they'll have the same DNA. But you don't look exactly like your brother or sister. That's because there's a scrambling of the DNA. And that's going to show up in these tests as slight differences in the ethnicity. So the third child comes in as well. And the third child has these 2 markers from mom, these 2 markers from dad, these 3 markers from dad. All 3 children have exactly the same parents, have exactly the same ancestors, but yet their DNA profiles show up differently because they're getting different pieces from mom and dad. Okay, so think about that when you look at those ethnic tests. Your sister might show up a little bit, and those ethnic tests are important because they show up some surprises, right? I had Native Americans show up in mine, and I'm still trying to figure that out. A little bit. Some people have Middle Eastern show up, some people have Asian show up, some people have African show up. That's deep in your ancestry because the further back you go, the more diverse we are. But you might have it and your brother or sister might not. It still comes from your parents, it just gets expressed in you and not in the brother and sister, and this is the reason why. I'll close with that.